let me first share with you, frankly, why we chose these particular three gentlemen. And I know the criticism I'm going to get. I apologize beforehand. We should have also had a woman on the panel, but that was my mistake. So let's just move on from that issue. First thing, the topic is Arab American or U.S. Arab relations. When you're talking about a global power like the U.S., and if you want a country of tremendous regional influence like Egypt, where AUC is situated, you need to deal with both strategy, day-to-day issues, and how you deal with politics and politics in the larger definition of the word. To do so, we chose to have people who really cover these three areas. And without any particular order, but I'll go from the macro to, if you want, the more micro issues. I was very glad to invite Alan Stoga here, who is if you want, a really high, top-notch strategist and an internationalist in many respects. Ibrahim will get into the details of Alan's prestigious CV. We've taken advantage of the generosity of AUC by picking on its president, Frank Riccardioni. Frank is a former ambassador to Egypt and to Turkey, therefore understands not only American policy in the Middle East, but also sensitive issues in the Middle East. And as many of you know, Egypt-Turkey is one of those major sensitive issues. And Shibit al-Hami is a former American diplomat who's a very well-known political scientist and academic, presently at the University of Maryland. And he also, like Frank, has followed and written about many of the issues that affect US policy in the Arab world and many of the issues that are quite urgent and important for the Arab world. So with those introductions, personally, I'd love really to listen to the speakers addressing those particular angles in the minutes that they speak. They don't have to choose only those angles, but I'd really love to hear that as part of their presentation. But let me, which is very difficult to do for a former diplomat, actually give up the floor and allow others to speak. Let me invite Ibrahim to, as he has done marvelously in the past, to take the lead to moderate this Tahrir Dialogue and to formally and more properly introduce our distinguished guests. Ibrahim, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nabil. Good evening for everyone in Cairo and in time zones close to Cairo's. Good afternoon for our panelists in the United States and in our audience in North America. Dean Fahmy has been kind enough to introduce me, so I have no need to introduce myself. Just to reiterate that I'm a professor of global affairs at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and I'm the director of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo. Let me point out at the beginning that there is Arabic interpretation. For those who need interpretation, there is Arabic interpretation. At the bottom of the screen, to your right, there is interpretation. Just press Arabic, you will have the Arabic interpretation. To interventions in Arabic, you will have to press English, otherwise have it on off. This is the Tahrir Dialogue number 91 on U.S. Arab relations, and Dean Fahmy has welcomed the panelists. I'd like to also welcome them and to welcome our audience to this Tahrir Dialogue. We have had quite faithful audiences who participate, who attend, and who are active in the events we organize. This event is about U.S. Arab relations in this particular moment of the beginning of the new administration. After 4 years of what we could call sui generis approaches to global interactions, most of the world expects from the new Biden administration a coherent outlook on the system of international, including regional relations. The world also expects that this outlook will be more in conformity with the norms and rules that major and less major powers have devised for the international system in the last 75 years. The Middle East is part of this world that has expectations from the new US administration. In fact, it may be one of the regions in the world that has the most expectations, tinted with apprehension on the part of some regional actors from the new administration. Nevertheless, as the description of the dialogue points out, doubts exist about the priority that the administration will give to the Middle East and its lingering problems, which are many. The Israeli-Palestinian, the Syrian, Libyan, Yemeni conflicts, the Iran nuclear program, the situation in Iraq, the dispute in the Eastern Mediterranean. The approaches that the administration will adopt towards these problems have been the subject of much debate, which have also turned around the priority the Biden administration will give to democracy and the rule of law in the region. And then the U.S. Arab relations do not take place in a vacuum. They are situated in a system of global relations where other great powers are active, particularly China, Russia, and the European Union. Where does the new administration see the positioning of the region in global geopolitics? And where do regional actors see the Arab world and the Middle East in the same global geopolitics? Do these perspectives fit with each other, or do they rather diverge? The Tahrir Dialogue, number 91, is privileged to line up three prominent panelists, the fourth being the host of the dialogue, with rich experiences with successive US administrations and with the American foreign policy establishment. The panelists will reflect on whether, when, and how the Biden administration will deal with the issues affecting and involving the Middle East. Our guests and panelists are in alphabetical order of their second names: Frank Richardson, Alan Stoga, and Shibli Talhami. Our host and panelist also is Nabil Fahmy. I will only briefly introduce the panelists since their bios were attached to the invitation to the dialogue. Frank Richardson is the president of our university, the American University in Cairo, since 2016. He was US Foreign Service officer between 1978 and 2014 and served as ambassador to Egypt, Turkey, and the Philippines. Frank also worked in other Middle East countries, such as Afghanistan and Iran. He speaks Arabic and Turkish. And Frank served as the vice president of the Atlantic Council and as the director of the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. Alan Stoga is an entrepreneur and strategist with extensive experience in public relations, communications, geopolitics, banking, and government. He currently serves as executive chairman of the Thalberg Foundation and as president of Zenny Communications, a New York-based firm that provides business and geopolitical counsel to global corporations. He also served as senior advisor and managing director of Kissinger Associates. Shibli Talhami is the Anwar al-Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, College Park, and most importantly, is director of the University of Maryland Critical Issues Poll, a rich source of information for those who follow the region. He is a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Institution. He has been active in the U.S. foreign policy arena, having been senior advisor to the United States Special Envoy for the Middle East, have been a member of the U.S. delegation to the trilateral U.S. Israeli-Palestinian Anti-Incitement Committee, and he has published widely acclaimed book, including a best-selling The Stakes, America and the Middle East. The host, Nabil Fahmy, as he said himself, is the founding dean of GAP, the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, since 2009. He is an Egyptian career diplomat who served as ambassador to Japan from 1997 to 1998 and to the United States from 1999 to 2008. He has a broad range of interests, including in particular regional security, disarmament, non-proliferation, Arab-Israeli diplomacy, and he crowned his career at the service of the Egyptian government by occupying the post of foreign minister at the critical transitional juncture of 2013-14, and he has recently published an account of his career under the title Egyptian Diplomacy in War, Peace, and Transition. After this introduction, I will give the floor successively to the panelists to make preliminary statement of some 8 minutes. I will then put some questions to the panelists after Dean Fahmy intervenes and raises questions of his own. I will put questions to the panelists aiming at establishing a dialogue between you. Welcome to raise questions and make short comments if they wish to, using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. I will collect the questions and comments and direct them to the panelists. I will first give the floor, if you don't mind, to Alan Stoga. He's a strategist, to talk to us about what he has understood as the strategy in international relations of the new Biden administration, how it is affected by the Biden outlook to the world, by the outlook of the Democratic Party, but then by the outlook of the foreign policy establishment in the United States and that of American society, which we have witnessed recently is quite divided on a number of issues, including on its outlook the outlook of their country, the US, to the outside world. Alan, you have the floor for some 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, and thank you, Nabil, both for the invitation and the opportunity. Let me start by quoting myself, which is always a bad way to start something. I gave a talk a month ago, which started with the question, will the Biden administration even have time for foreign policy? And my answer to that day, and my answer today is I'm not sure. This is a government that comes to power at a uniquely bad moment. Obviously, recession, the pandemic, but far more importantly, we are in the midst of a crisis in our own democracy that we have to solve in the next years, decide what kind of country we want to be, how we want to manage ourselves, how we want to go forward. And is it possible, Ibrahim, you alluded to the division in the country, is it possible to overcome that division? Clearly, President Biden, in some of his both campaign rhetoric and far more importantly, his early statements, his inaugural speech, talked convincingly of the need for unity, of the need to make this country come together and think together, have a common vision, first for itself and then for the rest of the world. If he achieves that, that would be an extraordinary accomplishment. But if he achieves it, he's not going to be able to do very much outside the United States. I think it's very unlikely that we're going to have anything like an aggressive, positive, deeply engaged foreign policy where we invest a lot of political capital to do the kinds of things that need to get done. First point. The second point is that, therefore, I expect we're primarily going to be reactive. We will be reacting to crises. We'll be reacting to problems. We'll be playing defense, not offense. That's the bad news. But there is some, I think, terrific good news to consider. The first, of course, is that President Biden himself and his foreign policy team more generally are clearly deeply experienced. And even more than the experience, they're competent. And we've just had 4 years of the opposite of both experience and competence. So having an American administration that is, in fact, knows where the bathrooms are, knows where the doors are, knows how the thing works, that already gets you in a place that we've not been at for a while. And I say it facetiously, but I mean it very seriously. The competence of the U.S. has been the thing, or the incompetence of the U.S., so to put it in the negative, has been the thing that's disturbed me even more than some of the policy positions that have been taken in the last several years. So the good news is experience, competence. What do they want to do? And obviously that's what we're going to talk about today. I think there's two basic driving forces as this administration thinks about its foreign policy. One is they want to undo almost whatever Donald Trump did. President Biden has already set a record in executive actions in the first days in office compared to his predecessors, not just in domestic policy, but also in foreign policy. There is almost a mantra, I suspect it's a bit like that old Carter thing, Clinton thing, it's the economy stupid. It's Trump stupid, probably is written somewhere in the White House on the wall. And if Trump did it, we want to undo it. Now, that's not universally true. Jerusalem is a perfect example of something that will not be undone. But there is this basic driving force. If Trump did it, let's undo it, and let's undo it sooner rather than later. And then the other driving force is, and I suspect my colleagues would disagree with this a bit, if Obama did it, let's do it again. This is a bit, in at least a point of departure, the third Obama administration, as opposed, in my judgment, as opposed to the first Biden administration, not just in the personnel, but in the way they seem to be thinking about a lot of the problems. You see it, for example, in the Iranian discussion. So on the one hand, it's about undo Trump. On the other hand, it's about resurrect Obama. The next point is in addition to competence, this is an administration that is going to do, is already doing an awful lot of signaling. They believe in symbols. So you've seen things like the Paris Climate Accord immediately. You've seen things like the declaration on Iran immediately. This is about putting out those symbols and saying, we're going to signal big things, even if we don't really have plans of how we're going to do them. But we want to signal that we're back. In fact, the president's used those words repeatedly. Blinken's used those words repeatedly. We're back in the game. I'm skeptical, but certainly that's their signal. And then the final big point is human rights. It was true to an extent under the Obama administration, but I think it's going to be true in spades that one of the principal filters of this team, of this presidency, is going to be a human rights filter that is going to drive a lot of what they do, for better and for worse. Put aside that issue. Is it better or for worse? But clearly, and you see that in the makeup of some of the people who are in the administration that had that in their background, Susan Rice, Samantha Powers, others, Tony Blinken. But clearly that human rights filters would be terribly important. So what does that mean? It means some of the things they've already done. They've told us they're going to release the Khashoggi file. That will put that issue back up on top of the pile, for better or for worse. We've suspended arms sales to the kingdom and to the UAE. It's a temporary suspension, but once you suspend something, if you reinstate it, you're going to have to reinstate it with conditions. That's the nature of suspensions. We have suspended the Houthi designation as a terrorist organization. Again, undoing Trump. We have talked about reopening dialogue with the Palestinians. I don't know what that means. It means not doing what Trump did, for sure. So you've got a lot of these little pieces moving, almost all of them in that spirit of either it's not Trump, we're not Trump, and we are more like Obama. Not a bad place to start. And my final point would be my first point. All that said, I am terribly skeptical that Secretary Blinken has a lot of space to maneuver because I don't think there is particularly a lot of support in the body politic, in the Congress, Senate or the House, for great initiatives outside the country. I wish it were opposite, but I don't think it is. So let me stop there and pass the baton.
Thank you very much, Alan. You raised so many issues with so many ideas, and I'm sure the panelists we have will react to what you said. They probably will have their own ideas now that may be in agreement with yours or maybe differ, but I will certainly get back with some of the issues that you raised and put questions to them in that respect. Frank, you know the Middle East inside out. You have served and worked in so many countries in the Middle East. You represented the United States and you lived in the Middle East as a non-representative, non-governmental representative at the same time. What is your view? Can the U.S. really completely lose interests and divert its attention from the Middle East? We know that it has so many on its plate. How will the Middle East fit in the broader foreign policy of the United States? And what do you think the priorities they will address in the Middle East?
Well, thank you, Ibrahim, and let me echo Nabil and Alan in thanking you and the staff and team for putting this together. Even technically, it's a challenge to get these things, even after all the rehearsals we've had for this past year, to make them come out well. But then when you layer in interpretation on top of it, it's another complication. So thanks to the team for putting this together. I'm also flattered not only by the number of participants from outside, but the many names I recognize of extremely distinguished participants. Very honored that you're participating with us today. Ibrahim, even before this, you had posed in the introduction to this session, and you've just reiterated it, the question that Alan also touched on, whether the Americans will have the time, the ability, you use the word bandwidth, people use that, just the ability to attend to world affairs as we must, and in particular, Middle Eastern affairs and relationships. And that's a question I know people have been talking about during this whole period since November 3rd, since the election results came in. I think the simple answer is it's not a matter of choice always. Different administrations come in emphasizing or giving greater or lesser emphasis to foreign policy, depending on the issues of the moment, the Iraq War, Israel-Palestine, whatever, over the years that I was in government. But even those administrations that come in and emphasize domestic policies find that they cannot afford to ignore not only the world, but the Middle East in particular. It just is too involved. The issues of this region are big and touch on everything else in the world. When states fail here, it unleashes waves of refugees into Europe. With that go the global spread of disease and economic disruptions that go with those things. The world cannot afford to ignore the terrible problems of the Middle East, and the United States, like it or not, and I think most Americans now, having come to these past few years, do understand we cannot withdraw from the world in the way that some elements of the Trump philosophy seem to say, we tell the world what to do. If they want to listen, let them go to hell. I think we're back on a kind of balance. So to the number one question you've posed, I think the new administration will find it must attend. And I'm confident with the appointments that President Biden has made or announced pending Senate confirmation, that that's what they intend to do. And they're putting extremely competent and experienced people in charge precisely because they believe we've got to pay this solid attention with competent expert people, regardless whether this one leans this way or one leans the other. To the second question, I'll sort of address that. Then the second question, what their policies will be, and then finally, what are the biggest challenges? In all this, I'll echo, I think, what Alan has said. As to what the policies will be, they've signaled that very openly. In fact, it's more than signaling, they've communicated it openly. Even before taking office, even before the results of November 3rd, before the elections, the people who are now either taking office or announced as appointees have written extensively and spoken extensively of their views. And the Democratic Party platform itself was a coherent policy platform. Something quite so boring in the past as to be, not so deeply studied. Oh, it's only a policy platform. Now something like that is thrillingly normal, that there is policy making by people who understand what policy is, public policy is, the processes of public policy formation involving not only the branches of government, the executive branch and the Congress principally, sometimes challenged in courts, but also a public conversation through what was disparagingly called, the establishment or the blob or the swamp or whatever, but people who are involved in debating, articulating, studying, bringing data to bear, comparing opinions, which ultimately get resolved in the discussion and the work between Congress and the executive. That's happening again. So the policies that the administration will adopt, they've made extremely clear. They've not only been working on policy production, but communicating of policy and communicating very well with things as mundane as press conferences, almost daily press conferences with a protocol and with topics and with substantive responses that are not just about personalities or anger or emotion. These refreshingly normal things are happening. So we can go into that as we discuss. That make clear emphases on Iran, paying attention to the Palestinians, again, the things that Alan has touched upon. The directions they're going are there. Democracy and human rights. Yes, many of the appointees have been activists in that area. To one extent or another, at least in my decades of public service, American values have always infused our policy making and communications one way or another. The level of skill in pursuing our national objectives, shaped by our values, has varied. But this is a very skillful group, and I'm quite confident about that. Finally, the biggest area of challenge, again, I guess I would echo Alan. I think it's to restore American influence, not to say power. I could say power, but in that maybe I would emphasize the whole of what American influence and power was, not only military or even the economic might, the wielding of sanctions or trade favors, but also that what Nye called some decades ago soft power. I never liked that term because it seemed almost cynical. But to the extent that America is perceived as competent, that Americans, American society, American government is perceived as high in a way, inspirational, has its act together, having problems, but addressing its problems, whether racism and bigotry, political division, having the political structures and political leadership to articulate the problems, address the problems, deal with them in some way that is mature and gives confidence, I think is the challenge before you can even pursue these policies. People are not going to listen to the United States if they think we do not know what we're doing, or worse, that we do know what we're doing and it is inimical to their interests. In my experience in the past, it was usually the latter. People assumed America knew what it was doing. We had great intelligence. We knew, not a sparrow would fall from a tree, but the CIA would know about it and why, In my past, I had to explain to people, do not discount lack of knowledge or even competence to explain why America is doing this or that particular thing. I think now the opposite is there. I think the past several years have shown a real problem of knowing what we're doing and going about it in prudent, predictable, understood, transparent ways. And that, I think, is restored through the very processes of American government. After all, it is a democracy. For all its ugliness and messiness of our politics, this past period, especially, culminating in January 6th, our systems have worked. We did have a legitimate change of political leadership, and we are known public intellectuals or public figures who tend to, I think, restore confidence that things are not going to be the same. We're not going to go back to normal, whatever that was before the Trump administration or before COVID. Some things have been stretched out of shape, many for the better, I would argue. But I believe that that challenge of restoring American influence and the perception of competence comes from demonstrating it, both in domestic affairs, being able to deal with racism and bigotry and so forth, equality, economic disparities, and internationally. I'm pretty sure we've made a good start on that, but for me, that's a key question. Will we be able to sufficiently restore our influence to bring it to bear behind the policy objectives we're articulating? Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Frank. You have also given us food for thought, and I'm sure that the panelists will comment on some ideas you have raised. I will also put some questions to them in respect of what you have just said. But for the moment, I will turn to Shibli Tilhami. With such an experience in academia, within the American foreign policy establishment, but also with a special connection to the region and to the Arab world. So he's very well positioned to look at the issues we are discussing from the two sides, from the American side and from the Middle East and Arab side. So my question to him is, what do you think, Shibli, that actors in the Arab world can do or should do to attract the attention to their issues of the new administration, to convince it to give these issues priority, and to contribute to the success of the U.S. administration in addressing their own concerns? What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to participate again. And I normally participate in person, obviously, as happened last year. This year, we're doing it virtually. And thank you for including me in this excellent panel. If you, Ibrahim, just to start with your question, but then, turn it around a little bit. As Ellen said, I think it's true that on many issues, including in the Middle East, the Biden administration will be reactive because of the nature of priorities that it faces. And in that sense, understanding that and understanding how it, ranks its priorities is very helpful for regional actors who want to engage, to be proactive in creating options to which the administration is likely to respond. So I think that question, therefore, is meaningful. But I want to put it in perspective about sort of where the administration is coming from. Obviously, I echo what Frank and Ellen has said about the type of people who are in place. These are people who are experienced, knowledgeable, competent, and I think have worked together before. Many of them we know. I've worked with many of them personally. So in that sense, this is a group that is going to be far more deliberate in the way it is going to design policy and much more focused and much more careful about how it prioritizes itself. But having said that, I want to just reinforce the nature of prioritizing that's taken place within the administration. Obviously, I don't need to remind people about our immediate priorities at home. I mean, forget the international community. You know, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. We're still in the middle of an economic crisis. We're still in the middle of very high unemployment. We are in the middle of the most unprecedented divide in modern American history, in a way that we're still trying to grapple with to even understand it. And so these are not small divides. In Congress, you know, the Senate is divided 50-50, yet it's tipped in favor of the Democrats by virtue of the vote of the vice president, but still on many issues, this is going to be very close. So keep in mind that, you know, unless there's some strategic priority that is pressing on the administration, many of those issues will be addressed, obviously, because the U.S. is compartmentalized and there will be experts working on them, but they will not attract the top priority for a president or the White House, and certainly for Congress. So keep that in mind. But the second thing to add to that, which is something that we all have to keep in mind. People have criticized the Obama administration for wanting to, you know, sort of pull out of the Middle East. And frankly, you know, in the region, we've had this kind of conflict. On the one hand, people don't want the U.S. to be in the Middle East. On the other hand, many governments want the U.S. to be in the Middle East. But put that aside, one reason for that, and one reason why people assume the same about Trump, is that in fact, the Middle East has diminished strategically in America's priorities. Certainly since the end of the Cold War, the decline of the importance of oil, the non-pressing issues on the Arab-Israeli conflict in terms of imminent war. And so in that sense, you know, clearly the U.S. doesn't place as much importance on the region. It's not that the U.S. is uninterested, because there remain critical issues, whether it's you know, economic and oil, whether it's the presence of American forces, whether it's Israel. Those are still all issues, but they are not as important as before. And I want to say also in terms of expectations. So obviously, inevitably, people are going to compare with the Trump administration. We started, our first two speakers mentioned that, both because the Trump administration was so unique in multiple ways that it's kind of now going back to, you know, what we tend to expect from the United States. But one thing that was unique about the Trump administration that may be missed is that while strategically Trump as president came into office thinking the Middle East isn't important anymore, he doesn't want to be dragged into the region, nonetheless, his administration, for what might be called accidental reasons, made the Middle East a top priority in its diplomacy. I mean, a top priority, and I don't mean that lightly, for the following reason, because he obviously, what we have come to know about the president, he wasn't very engaged or involved with issues and details of issues, didn't know much about them. He made personal decisions, instinctive decisions, sometimes political decisions, but they weren't very involved in terms of following details. And he subcontracted the Middle East to his son-in-law, who was his key advisor, his ambassador to Israel, and others who basically had this issue as their top priority issue for ideological reasons. And in that sense, they also had the power of the presidency behind them in a way that enabled them to mobilize the United Nations to mobilize American power to exercise in the United Nations with the international community, to bring in the coercive power, the incentive. Look at the deals that were made, basically coming out of you know, big strategic decisions, such as to recognize the Western Sahara, Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, to recognize removing the Sudan from the terrorism list, to make decisions on selling the UAE F-35. Those are not like decisions that are typically, you know, come out of an assistant secretary of state. These are big White House decisions that also often require mobilizing Congress. To think that the administration mobilized American power on that scale to create that kind of change, this is not going to happen. This is an accident of history. This was not a strategic prioritizing the Middle East. It was really an accident in history. It's not going to repeat itself under the Biden administration. I tell you, it's not going to repeat itself, in my opinion, ever, because this was a unique circumstance. So the Middle East has been a priority in some very important ways that we miss. And certainly the Arab-Israeli conflict is the core of that engagement. But that set of relationships, that sense of mobilizing American power isn't going to happen under the Biden administration. Let me just move very quickly to address the issues that I see them that will be prioritized to the extent that the Middle East will be prioritized, and especially issues that will have strategic consequence for the U.S. The first one is Iran. Undoubtedly, Iran is the immediate strategic priority for the administration in the Middle East. The reason for it is very similar to the reason that President Obama, at the time that I had advised that administration, made a decision to elevate the Iran issue into a top priority strategic issue for him to get the Iran nuclear deal. And the reason for it was very simple, that he felt that America's allies in the Middle East were pushing him toward a conflict or dragging him into a conflict he doesn't want, and he does not want to be entangled in war with Iran. And that would not be good for the region, would not be good for the United States. And for that reason, he made concluding the Iran nuclear deal as a way of preempting the possibility of conflict with Iran, not only, and obviously at the same time, limiting Iranian nuclear capabilities and preventing them from quickly developing nuclear weapon, both of these together. I see that now in the same way, because what happened during the Trump administration is there was a tremendous pressure on Trump, and Trump resisted. This is one issue where allies of Trump in the Middle East failed to get Trump to play. They got him to, impose more sanctions, to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, but not to be dragged into open conflict with Iran. And I think now we see the pressure not to return to the Iran nuclear deal and try to negotiate beyond the limited scope of that deal, something that I think the Biden administration and people in the Biden administration believe is intended essentially to cool the deal, because there is no room for major negotiations. Dragging on is not going to solve the problem. So for that reason, I think in the same way that Obama calculated that this is strategic priority, I think the Biden will calculate this strategic priority, and they will find a way to return to the Iran nuclear deal. This is going to, in some ways, depending on how the players in the region will react to it, whether it's the Israelis or America's allies in the Arab Gulf states, that's going to define, in a way, the relationship between them and this administration on other issues. The second issue is Yemen. I think that's likely to be a priority. We already saw that in the weapons, suspension of weapons deals. I think that issue is important for multiple reasons. A, because it has had broad support for stopping the war and stopping America's role in that war in Congress. Remember that Trump had vetoed a congressional resolution that had both Republican and Democratic support. This president is going to do that, obviously. So I think the Yemen issue, in terms of America's role with the coalition, the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, and sort of diplomacy to end that war, I think that's going to certainly be important. And third, just to mention briefly, and I know we'll come back to this in the discussion, I don't want to take too much time, the Israel-Palestine question, where I think what we will see is a lot of important steps early on. We already saw pronouncements about renewing aid to the Palestinians, which is obviously something the Palestinians want, renewing the dialogue. The question is whether the United States would reopen the consulate in East Jerusalem, which had essentially, in effect, was the embassy to the Palestinians. Things of that sort, I think the administration will be able to do relatively quickly, but let's be real. After 8 years of Obama, focused on this issue even more than the Biden administration is likely to do, the needle wasn't moved toward two-state solution. Right now, 12 years later from the time Obama started, many setbacks, some realities imposed by the Trump administration. going back to the same time to diplomacy is not going to move the needle. And I don't think that in the short term, Biden has the bandwidth to think of more compelling alternatives. I'll end with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shibli. You also have pointed and emphasized issues of strategic priority to the new administration. In fact, I saw that at the beginning you said that Middle East will not be a real priority because the administration will not have the time for the Middle East. But then you said that there will be some issues that the administration cannot escape dealing with. We will be back to that. Before I try to establish a dialogue, let me turn to Nabil Fahmy. Nabil, will you have any questions to raise or comments to make?
First, thank you to the three panelists. As we expected, they came in with very enlightening comments. Some of them where they shared, and others where they added on. Let me take the role, if you want, of a discussant in many respects. In my experience, working with American officials in the past and living in America in different capacities, I always found Americans explaining foreign policy to their own people in terms of the threats that exist abroad, rather than in terms of the benefits that exist from being a global power and a superpower. And there's a sense now that even if the foreign policy establishment wants to be proactive, wants to engage seriously, that the American community doesn't want really to play that much of a role globally. So that's really a question. And let me add to it that I've had the pleasure of knowing almost all, I'm trying to think of somebody in the administration, in the foreign policy group that I don't know, but I've had the pleasure of either meeting or working with almost all of them. And they are, as you three said, highly capable professional people. But they all look at the world the way it used to be. I'm not sure I see anybody there who's looking at a world where America is not a global power, looking at the world where there isn't a Cold War, where there are more sub-regional conflicts than regional conflicts, and consequently, what role America has to play in the absence of a big threat. And the idea that the threat now is China isn't enough to have a comprehensive, coherent foreign policy on many things. So one, and I'm going to put out just a couple of questions, and any of the three distinguished panelists can choose whether they want to address one or more of them. So one question really is, besides being busy, does America as a nation want to play that role? And if I may say, if they do, what do they have to do in talking about their own region, talking about that to their own people? I say this because it will ultimately affect U.S. Arab relations as well. My second point, frankly, is, as Shibli correctly said, the Middle East is now, in the absence of a Cold War and with less dependence on energy, less important to America on a day-to-day basis. Consequently, and that was before Trump, by the way, and it now continues. But to have a situation where American diplomacy was almost absent from all of the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, except for the Arab-Israeli conflict, which they decided to make a completely different concept of. They were absent in Libya, absent in Syria, absent in Yemen to a great degree. And I can go on and on. So will the administration now, with all of this capacity and capability, really want to engage on these issues? I know they want to engage on Iran, but besides that, I'm not actually sure where they'd want to engage. Let me add a point here. In my last tenure in the States, my concern was, and I say this from that perspective, having known American foreign policy people way earlier, they seem to look at the Middle East only from the perspective of terrorism or anti-terrorist activities. Do Americans really understand the Middle East as it is today? I'm not saying it's the best or the worst situation, but do they really understand what's happening in societies today? Or are they looking at it the way it used to be 4 years ago or 8 years ago and so on? So to deal with those issues, you're going to have to deal with different issues that were not traditional in the past. And I'm not sure that America post 9/11 looks at the region from that perspective any longer. Let me throw out a more controversial question. America's strongest allies in the Middle East traditionally, or forget about the word allies, although that applies in many respects to some countries, the players it was most engaged with in the past were Egypt, Israel, the Palestinians, given the issue per se, Iraq, Saudi, and if you want, Emirates at one point. Where will these relations be? What are the sensitive issues for each one of them? Where are the opportunities? You all made the point, and frankly, I've been arguing this here back home, that regional players have to take the initiative on their issues. And I've frankly been arguing that for a long, long time. But these countries in particular are of interest. I'd like to get a bit more insight in terms of where America will be and how it will deal with these particular countries. And I know where some sensitivities are, and I agree with the point I think made by Alan at the beginning. America for the next 6 months will be trying to prove it's not Trump, and then probably fall back into Obama plus or Obama minus. But after that, it will have to look at its national interest with the countries in the region. So after what I call a cooling off period, where will relations be with these countries in particular? Let me stop with throwing, and one last issue, and so I don't jump in too many times. It's not a Middle East issue per se, but it's an Arab issue, at least in terms of for Egypt and its national security. Where will America be on the Renaissance Stand negotiations? Let me stop there.
Thank you, Nabil. I think you have raised so many issues. So before I put any questions to the panelists, I would invite them to react to what you have just said. If they can do that in some 3 minutes, because you have 3 minutes each, of course, because you have some questions from the audience. I have my own. So I first give the floor to Alan to react to what Nabil Fahmy had just said.
The bad news is I agree with almost everything Nabil said, but I would make just 2 very quick points. We don't do strategy anymore, we do tactics. I don't think that's been the case for some time. I don't think it's going to change. We are reactive. We don't have foreign policy. We don't have a nuanced understanding of the world and a defined where do we want to get to within that nuanced understanding. Frankly, I see no possibility of that happening under this administration, nor the next, whoever the hell it may well be. The second point, and is this, part of the reason for that, if America, which there's no one such thing, had a magic wand, we would be an autarky. We would simply say, we don't want the rest of the world. Technology is increasingly going to let us do that. You referenced energy. In December, we imported 0 barrels of oil from the Saudis. That is a symbol that most missed, but it is reflective in not the question of do we have a foreign policy establishment that wants to do a lot of things, that has a lot of the right ideas, that has a good understanding. But is that the United States understanding? No, it's the State Department. It's some of our friends, mutual friends. We know how the world works. We know what ought to be done. I would argue, which is the final point, vehemently, that if you were, in fact, to try to rally the nation behind almost any foreign policy initiative where you really needed a lot of political will, you couldn't do it. It's not going to happen. And we need to be realistic about that. One more point, because the real issue in terms of priorities, and it's been mentioned several times, is China. Absent a real developed strategy vis-a-vis the Chinese, we're going to be playing in a different league very soon. And will reinforce that tendency to go home and try to forget about the world. We can't succeed. We can never succeed. Crises happen. For some reason, the U.S. has a view on the Myanmar coup this morning, because we have to have a view on everything, right? That's what happens at the press conference every day. That doesn't mean we have a strategy. It doesn't mean we have a policy, and I don't think it's about to happen.
Thank you very much, Alan. Frank, what's your reaction?
Likewise, agreeing very much with both Nabil and Alan have said. I might take a little bit different perspective. I recall a conversation with the late Dick Lugar, not only a statesman, but he was a politician and a member of Congress, of the Senate, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, sponsored legislation that bears his name in foreign affairs. And we were talking about this very subject, I'll say, I don't know, earlier in my career, let's say 15 years ago. He passed away a couple of years ago. And I was saying, you know, isn't it a challenge for you as you're here in the establishment, you understand America's international interest. How difficult is it, Senator, to cover these issues with your constituents? He said, don't sell the American people short. Don't expect that because they're simple farmers from Indiana, they don't know the daily and even hourly price of agricultural commodities on world markets. More than ever, and again, this is early part of this century, I'll say, it was a good 15 years ago. They are tracking things they know in a deep and direct way that America's prosperity depends on interconnection with the world, and that what we do in Washington at one level or another matters to their well-being. It's not only about national defense, it is about prosperity as well. So he says it takes some patient engagement, but don't assume indifference on the part of the American people, at least in specific areas. People know that it's important, and some will even know with some sophistication in a specific area how it's important. So it is a challenge of leadership, of political leadership. With someone like Biden in the White House, it's quite unusual in recent years to have a politician who has had so much experience in global affairs, in world affairs, in foreign relations. He should be able to articulate to this constituency or that, and to head an administration that does that engagement, that necessary homework to convince skeptical people, a skeptical public, about the need for this or that intervention. And by the way, that skepticism isn't always bad. The skepticism about deploying of troops, for example, would have served us well. I mean, partly that's what got Trump elected. The American people were skeptical about resort to military solutions for everything. Had others been more skeptical, you know, maybe there wouldn't have been that backlash that resulted in President Trump getting elected with that as a theme. So I don't know, maybe I just choose to be optimistic that with the right kind of communication, public engagement, it would sound patronizing. It would sound like, you know, a deep stater to say education of the public, as if the mandarins of Washington know all, and a few of our academic friends and others from outside. But the kind of engagement, explaining why liberalizing trade in a smart way is in America's economic interest, that we've done that with some degree of success in the past. Why freer, secure borders that are nonetheless open borders. Why it's important for foreign students to be able to come to America's academic industry, an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars with a B, lots and lots of jobs. those kinds of things can be done thoughtfully and I think successfully. So our core foreign policy issues have always been driven by security, prosperity, and our values, with different issues within those rising and falling with the times and with the administrations. Probably, I expect that will be, those three drivers will continue. What I hope is, and expect, that this administration will be better at engaging with the public through the media, through academia, through the Congress, more successfully, and help to form public consensuses behind that which the administration will decide we must do, whether it's on human rights, international rule of law, freer trade and investment, climate change, global spread of disease, not just COVID, but all the other antecedents of that, Ebola, HIV, AIDS. I don't know. I think there's some grounds to hope, but it won't be easy. It will take focus and work and skill.
If I may add, just to be more specific, I think that the way to think about sort of how the Biden administration is likely to look at regional issues and which ones to pick and choose to focus on beyond sort of strategic analysis up front is to contrast it on three levels with the Trump administration. First level is in an unprecedented way, the Trump administration's selection of issues to focus on the Middle East were Israel-centric. So say, why didn't they focus on Libya? Why didn't they focus on Algeria? Why didn't they focus on other issues that might be important? That was mostly driven by the fact that the people around Trump were focused on issues that mattered most to Israel. And the US has always focused on Israel in many ways. That's not new, but this is unprecedented in the way this was done in driving what is the agenda, whether it's normalization to Israel and the Arab state, whether it's what to do on the issue of Palestine, whether it's what to do on Iran. It was heavily centered on that. This administration clearly supports Israel, will still have a policy that is friendly to Israel on multiple levels at the core, but they will not select their choices across the region based on Israel as a starting point. That's going to be different, and therefore there will be engagement. The second way in which it's going to differ, the Trump administration, obviously in almost all its actions in the Middle East, has been unilateral. It didn't disregard international law, it disregarded international organizations. The UN or even the EU didn't work with, it was mostly bilateral and unilateral in its actions in the region. This administration is not going to be like that. They will work with international organizations, with allies like the EU, with regional actors, and devise a strategy accordingly. That's going to be critical in the way, particularly for an issue like Libya. And the third way is that the Trump administration was the most transactional administration we've seen in the history of the United States, where it's almost personal. It's almost a deal. I'll give you the Western Sahara, you give me a piece with Israel. I'll give you F-35s as long as you do X, Y, Z. So we have not seen a transactional administration like that in the past. There's always some transaction taking place. That's what diplomacy is about, but not in the same direct and blatant way that we've seen. This is going to be different, and that's going to matter for the way the U.S. engages these issues.
Thank you very much. I was going to give the floor to Shibli. Anyway, he took the floor, so he took his 3 minutes. I turn to Alan. Now. Alan wishes to comment on something Nabil has said, but I will also put a question to him. You said that Middle East issues and foreign policy issues will not be the top priority of the new administration. Shibli supported you, but Shibli then said there are some priorities that the US administration cannot escape. It cannot extricate itself from giving interest to these issues. And here he sort of was of the same view of Frank. Now, you are a strategist, Alan. If the US withdraws, if there is a power vacuum, someone else will occupy the space. You have China, you have Russia, and the US cannot bear the idea that China or Russia step in its place. And therefore, can the US really afford to be away? If it's away, someone else will come in. What do you think? Frank talked about the soft power of the United States because frankly, power is the ability to influence someone to take a position without using force. So soft power is extremely important. What do you say about this? Can the US really withdraw?
In effect, you've asked me the question that I was going to comment on, Nabil.
Very good.
I think the word if is the wrong word. We have withdrawn. If one does a slice of reality today and a slice of reality 10, 15, 20 years ago, the United States is no longer, it's a shadow of its global former self. That's simple a reality. The Obama administration talked about a pivot to Asia, which everybody in Europe recognized was a pivot away from something. And it never quite got to Asia. It got away from something, but never quite got somewhere else. So my first point would be very simple. We already have withdrawn in really fundamental ways. My second point would be, as much as I was trained as an economist, I'm a free trader, and I bleed free trade. But in fact, technology has changed the whole basis of the free trade model. We no longer need that global trade connectivity the way we needed for growth that we did in the past. And most particularly, the third point, that global engagement has completely failed our social contract. Part of the reason for Trump was that we screwed the middle class for 30 years. And those policies that we all supported, they weren't well implemented, we can all argue about that, did not produce growth and prosperity for the middle class in America. So my fourth point is, I don't think the question is if we're going to withdraw. The question is the pace of withdrawal, the nature of withdrawal, how we play. It's like watching the Germans play soccer, play football. They play defense really well versus watching the Brazilians play ball. They play offense really well. We're in the defensive mode, I think, permanently. I regret that deeply because that, if I had my magic wand, is not what I would be doing. But it's finally back to my point I was going to make on Nabil. And you and I've had this conversation before. I think the regional powers in the Middle East have to cope with the reality that we're not going to be as deeply engaged by any measure as we have been in the past. Good, bad, or ugly, that's for you all to decide, but I think that's just an objective fact. Now, will the Chinese rush in? Will the Russians rush in? Look, the Russians are a third-rate power. They're not rushing in anywhere that's relevant. They do have powerful cyber capacity, but so do half a dozen other countries. So thinking about Russia as though it was Russia, it is also a shadow of what it was. And I go back finally to the point I've made a couple times. It's all about the US and China. It's all about the region in China. This panel about China in the Middle East, I think, frankly, might even be more interesting than about America in the Middle East, because I love 60s music. We're playing the old 60s music here. And my kids look at me and say, "You're kidding me, that's music?" And my grandkids look at me and they don't even pretend it's music. So how do we update all of this for the realities that exist today? I really do, Nabil, think it's your problem now, much less than it was in the past. That's incredibly popular in most circumstances. I accept all that.
Thank you, Alan. Of course, Russia is not the Soviet Union. However, Russia can focus its power in some regions, some particular regions, such as it is doing in Syria, for instance, and it is trying to do in Libya. But I will turn to Frank and ask him what he thinks of what Alan had just said about the withdrawal of the United States. Is it a withdrawal of the United States, or is it a lighter weight of the United States in the global economy and in global politics, because you have other competitors? What the US represented in world product is no longer what it represents, what it represented 30 or 40 years ago. So there is a redistribution of power. Do you think that there is a withdrawal, Frank, or there is competition from other global actors, and therefore the United States cannot dictate as it used to be? But I have two other questions to you that were raised by our audience. How will the Biden administration, do you think, how will it deal with Turkey and the attempts of Turkey at being a regional power and its intervention in Libya, for instance? And then another question will be about the Biden administration and Saudi Arabia. How will the Biden administration deal with the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia is liberalizing measures, but at the same time is authoritarian means? What do you think? I know it's not really, and we still have Shibli and Nabil, but try to get it to us in 3 to 4 minutes if possible.
I will try to be brief and focused on these, and I see a lot of really good questions coming in the chat too. On the question of decline of the U.S., decline of the West, it's been a truism over these past, since the end of the Cold War anyway, a decade or two. I've always been among those saying, don't sell the United States short. It isn't so much the decline of the West, decline of the U.S. as the rise of the rest. Not the decline of the West, the rise of the rest, as everyone's been saying. China and India and so forth. That's been out there, and there's been lots written on it. I think, however, we probably have lost some ground in the United States by many objective measures, whether education or public health, and then the perceptions that generates, and some political decisions of, loudly drawing inward, raising walls rather than building bridges, et cetera. So we really have, I think, lost some influence that comes from I dare say, moral standing, or having been admired for our economic strength, even some of our values, I dare say, the openness, the experience that foreigners had coming and engaging in the United States, whether in government or business or academia or medicine or entertainment or sports. Something has been lost. What of that can be regained, I don't know, but I'm confident we're a dynamic country, and we have hit a refresh button, I think, at least in terms of our political leadership, and let's see if we can refresh culturally and in terms of the body politic as well. I hope so. So it goes back to the soft power business. We still have, we've burnt a lot of it. We've wasted a lot of our influence. I think lost a lot of it, but it was a pretty deep well of it. I don't see, the Chinese university. There are Chinese universities and Russian universities in, in Egypt and so forth. But I don't see people rushing to go to those places to educate themselves or their kids. There's some. I'd love to learn Chinese myself. I think that's important, and I would encourage that. But still, there's deep reserves of international desire to do some things like the Americans do, come to America, do business with Americans, be educated in America, get American medicine. The Chinese vaccine, well, if that's all that's going to be available, people will, I hope, get it. But there's much less data out there to convince people, and ordinary people who are not political around the world want to see data before they put new drugs into their arms. Anyway, I think it's a manageable thing. It's a challenge, but it's not like the game is over for the United States and its cultural power and its moral standing. We've lost a lot. I think some can be regained in a much more globally competitive thing. We will not dominate the way we did, but that's been true for a long time. On Turkey, how do I think the Biden administration will do it? I'm not part of the administration, but I think the short word is skillfully. They've got great sophistication and depth people that have been there, not only when I was serving there, but since and before, not only in Turkey, but know how to deal with Iraq, which is a big one. The hardy perennial problems in new forms, you know, the problem with Armenia now taking a new form with Nagorno-Karabakh, etc. Greece, Cyprus, all the rest. NATO and redoing, you know, bringing NATO and relations with Europe and European identity up to speed, and how Turkey will involve with that. I don't know, but I was present when then Vice President Biden came and interacted with then Prime Minister Erdogan and President Gül, and I saw the skill with which he did that. And by the way, Tony Blinken was along for that ride as well. So I think they will do it with great sophistication and not focus only on this or that element, but they will not be shy. I don't think they'll be shy. Values will come into it, whether in dealing with Turkey or, to your last question, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for that matter, Egypt. Yes, there will be values, I'm sure, of human rights and freedom and so forth, but sobriety as well. From everything that they have published and said, I expect there will be, I won't use the word pragmatism as a euphemism for or cover for indifference to human rights, but I think there is a worldliness and a pragmatism that properly balances or infuses the idealism. I think the balance seems there. They'll find their balance. There'll be internal debate within the administration and in the public. But when it comes to dealing with Saudi Arabia, they will recognize, I think, what's going on within that country and within the region, and understand that there's no single tool to turn Saudi Arabia into some kind of other than a kingdom, some kind of constitutional monarchy with a liberal sense of how one is supposed to govern. But around the edges, I should think they won't shy from engaging on internal matters, in whether in Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Turkey or elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Frank. Let me turn to Shibli. I will ask him also to intervene in 3 minutes, after which I will give the floor back to Nabil. You said something very interesting in your intervention, Shibli, about what I can understand as the policy making with regard to Palestine and Israel having been hijacked by a very sort of simple process of policy making. Now we are supposed to be back to a sophisticated system of policy making. How will this affect the policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? We know, we have heard, and I think we are already realistic, some of the measures adopted by the Trump administration will not be reversed, but others, I guess, bestowing legality on the settlements, for instance, this should be, I expect it to be reversed. Some sort of adherence to the international legal framework, not completely, because U.S. administration successively have not adhered to it. So what will change the frame of the negotiation? I would like to hear you address that, and also how will the U.S. administration, the new, deal with its close partners in Saudi Arabia and the UAE in respect of the war in Yemen? 3 minutes, please.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I didn't use the same words you used in describing what happened under Trump and now, so
I know. It's my interpretation.
But it's obviously you have a group of people who followed the Middle East and Israel-Palestine very closely for a long time. So this is at a minimum, it's a group that's familiar with the evolution of the conflict, with the evolution of American diplomacy, with the international positions. So they're not coming from nowhere, as happened with the people around Trump initially, who had absolutely no background. I mean, you had a real estate investor, real estate but a bankruptcy lawyer. You've had people who basically were not seasoned in this. You obviously have people who understand the context, but there are several things to keep in mind. There are some things that Trump did that just don't really matter too much, because the Trump plan as such was a plan. It wasn't an agreement. It wasn't something that was international. It could be disregarded. We've had many presidential plans that came and left, like the Reagan plan, for example. It didn't survive much. So that issue doesn't, the plan itself would not stop the Biden administration from returning to the same international law reference of the conflict, the starting points for negotiations, the frame of reference, the international resolutions, what's legal and what's not, and the same issue pertaining to settlements. One of the things that they will face on settlements, obviously, is whether to take a universally opposing view of any settlements, or to be a little more nuanced, which some people are arguing outside the administration, who have the ear of the administration. Some people say take a principled view opposing the settlements, or take a more flexible view to limit settlements, to be supportive of settlements that are closer to the green line. Well, the problem, of course, is once you go that path, it's a slippery slope, and you lose the principle of it, and that's part of the debate. I don't know how they will define that, where they will go on that. Second, there are some things already that they were trying to reverse, such as cutting off aid to the Palestinians, returning aid, and possibly to UNRWA as well. Some of that is, of course, complicated by congressional action. There is the Taylor Force Act, which has consequences not only for aid to the Palestinians directly, but also for the reopening of the PLO office in Washington. Those are not easy things, because they require either finessing them in some way, crafting a way to get around that, or bringing Congress along to modify, or maybe even talk to the Palestinian Authority to shift its position a little bit to accommodate it. That's not an easy thing to do. Even simple things that seem like, well, the administration can just reverse, it's not that simple. The big issue, of course, that happened that is harder to change is the moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Obviously, the embassy was moved actually to West Jerusalem, which, there's no way that an administration with the support of Congress is going to be able to move it back. Recall that Congress had required the administration for decades to move the embassy, and it was an exception that presidents had passed to prevent that from happening. So this is not going to be possible, and already Biden has said that's not going to be possible. The question on the opening of the consulate in Jerusalem may be more possible, and that might be something that they would do. But that doesn't shift the administration's position on Jerusalem, on the status of Jerusalem, because there's nothing that Trump did in declaring the status of Jerusalem that obligates this administration. So in some ways, they're going to return in principle to the same framework that existed when Biden left office, which was encoded one more time in the implicit, not the non-veto of the resolution that was passed just weeks before Trump assumed the presidency at the UN, reinforcing that framework. The real question, of course, is, will there be active diplomacy to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? There'll be diplomacy. There will be return. Partly the Palestinians want it, partly it's also in the Israelis' interest to do it. The question is that going to move the needle? Of course not. It's going to be more like conflict management. Part of the problem for the administration is just as it's doubling down on the two-state solution as the negotiated outcome, which is what Arab state position is, which is what the Palestinian position is, which is what the international community's position is. I would say a majority of experts on the Middle East say it's too late for the two-state solution. And there is no American administration that is capable of making this a priority enough to shift that paradigm. So on the one hand, some, even within the administration, may believe it's really too late, but we can't do anything about it, so let's manage. There's some people who truly believe it's still possible, but they're not going to be able to get anybody behind it to push it really further. That's really the dilemma, I think, that the administration is going to find itself in very soon.
Thank you very much, Shibli. I'll turn to Nabil. Nabil, I will keep from commenting, just 2 words. First, it's too late for the two-state solution. What do you think about that? And another observation, which is extremely important, I think, is that the United States, the President of the United States does not make international law. President Trump thought that what he did could bestow legality on Israeli actions. By the way, some Moroccan actors were very skeptical also about the recognition of Western Sahara as part of Morocco, because they thought that President Trump could not make the law. What do you think, Nabil, about that? I think we still have 3 minutes. If you can respect the 3 minutes so as to put an end to this dialogue.
Let me say the following. I don't think a two-state solution can be achieved by a process led by the US. If it is possible at all, it has to be by the regional countries changing the reality in the Middle East to make it an attractive course of engagement. It won't be resolved without the US, but the US will not take the lead on this. And let's not ignore history. Whether it's the US or the Soviet Union, war and peace in the Middle East always started by the Middle Eastern states. The only exception to that was the Madrid peace process, when President Bush, father, convened the conference post the liberation of Kuwait. Besides that, the Israelis went to war in '67, we went to war in '73, we started a peace process, and the US, more than the Soviet Union, welcomed that process, and we went on. So unless there's something on the ground or diplomatic thinking that's creative from the region, I don't expect the US to spend too much time on this. But that being said, let me add that I also don't think that President Biden will change any of the formal commitments he gave to Israel, whatever they may mean in terms of legality. But he's not going to spend any money on that. I would suggest, however, I don't really see why the US cannot publicly announce that it recognizes the Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders, and invites the Palestinians and Israelis to negotiate the details. That's in support of a two-state solution. It doesn't put the onus of negotiation on the US, but it does establish the reality that the Palestinians have a right to a state, and then the US accepts this. It also is much more consistent with those who argue a value-based foreign policy. I mean, the value of values is not when they're easy, it's when they're difficult. I mean, we can all claim we're principled, but unless you pay a price for the principle, it's just a gaming process. So again, I would like to see an open public declaration. I mean, don't forget, Clinton actually said that when he left office, that in his personal capacity, he would have wanted a Palestinian state. So anyway, that's just one suggestion, but 2 quick questions. Actually 3. The administration and political Islam. Any comments? Secondly, the US had 2 roles in the region. They were mentioned by the 3 speakers. Security, providing a security blanket or military support. Will it continue to give security blanket to, and I'm not talking about Israel. They give Israel so much equipment, it does its own blanket. But I'm talking about the Arab allies to the US. Will it continue to provide that, given that the Middle East is less important now? And secondly, what is the administration's posture, given the new reality in the US, on foreign aid, per se? I will let them either ignore my comments or digest them and comment. But in any way, I want to thank them for being here. Go ahead.
Does this mean that you can take another 10 minutes?
With the dean, you can always take 10 minutes.
Okay, go ahead, Alan
That's hard
first.
power, not soft power.
Look, I'm the dean and I'm the president here, so 10 minutes, I guess we can do.
Alan, go ahead. Can you react to Nabil's questions? For instance, about the Biden administration and political Islam and Islamic groups?
If and only if there is a serious deterioration in security, that is to say, a major terrorist attack. I continue to believe this is going to fundamentally be a reactive administration, that its priorities are in other areas. The department will do the things the department always does, and they'll do them much more competently than they did in the last 4 years. But in terms of how the president spent his time, what he will be briefed on, political Islam is about 1:45 at night if he's still up, I think, in terms of the issue. Ditto, by the way, foreign aid. Yes, we'll do some more foreign aid. There's a real chance actually that it could even be a bigger number because Washington has lost its mind when it comes to fiscal policy. So there are no limits on the American budget anymore. It was $3 trillion last year. God knows what it'll be this year. So if I were an advocate of foreign aid, I would find my friendly congressman or senator and get it in the bill because there's nothing that can't be passed at the moment. So foreign aid, you could even have more of it. And then finally, the point that everybody's made, we will play the multilateral game more than we have the last 4 years. I think that'll be more rhetorical than factual. I don't think we're going to provide a lot of resources to the multilaterals to act in a more aggressive way. And in my world, it's partly about us leaving our responsibilities behind and saying, don't talk to us, talk to the World Bank, talk to the IMF, talk to this, talk to that. And it's partly the right thing to do, but it's also a dodge.
Yes, but the World Bank and the IMF are very much influenced by American policy. What do you think, Frank?
Less and less.
Less and less, but still. What do you think, Frank? And in addition to the question of political Islam.
Yeah, I subscribe to all the foregoing, although in agreeing that it's more likely to be reactive. I agree with the deeper point that Alan had made is people have always assumed we are a country of strategy. Superpowers have to have strategies and so forth. There are philosophies and ideologies and broad approaches and some great speeches, but real strategy, other than at the start of the Cold War, Kennan, and that was the days of maybe grand strategy. But since the end of the Cold War, I would say there's much less of a vein of strategy in American policy, and we've been more reactive to world events than not, whether 9/11 or HIV/AIDS or Ebola or a war that breaks out here and there, the collapse of states, the Arab Spring. So I don't think that's really that new, that we're more reactive. And once again, an administration that is coming in very much focused on taking care of business at home as a prerequisite for being effective in dealing with the world, but also that is so sober to know that it cannot ignore the world. It is not a choice. It's going to have to be involved and keeping a good watch and keeping engaged through multilateral organizations, which we created after all. The United States was the architect of the second half of the 20th century world order, a rules-based international order that the Trump people deliberately attacked as globalism and not in American interests. So yes, I think we'll be reactive, but sort of watchful, competently watchful anticipation, I think, of problems rather than staying asleep. By saying reactive, it's not like we're going to ignore them and wake up to them after they've burst on. I hope we will be watchful and anticipating in expert ways and preparing where we can here and there without so many grand initiatives. We're Secretary, what is it, special negotiator, special envoy, Senator, former Secretary Kerry on climate change. We see some initiatives like that in the global arena. On political Islam, I think the bloom is off of that rose in terms of political Islam being something that is entirely compatible with democracy. People will, theorize about this and have academic discussion, but to the extent that there was any sort of romantic blinders on, thinking that the Muslim Brothers were in fact Democrats in Islamist clothing, I think that's by the boards, from what I can tell in discussing things here. People talk about political inclusion, et cetera, but it won't be a code word for letting in people with a deliberately Islamist agenda that is actually quite extreme and narrow.
Thank you
Just
very
my
much,
guess.
Frank. Thank you very much. I will not make comments, but I will ask Shibli to comment on what has just been said. But I'll just ask him also to deal with the question of human rights. What do you think that the Biden administration, or how do you think the Biden administration will deal with the question of human rights in the region?
And first of all, on the two of the questions that Nabil asked for, on political Islam, I would add, in addition to what Frank said, that in general, the ethos around this administration, people of the administration, is not to favor the overemployment of the term terrorist because it limits diplomacy, and we saw that in relation to the Houthis already. But in general, that's not something as a philosophy that is favored, because it seemed to take away a lot of diplomatic possibilities that may be available within the toolbox. On will the administration be committed to defending its allies? I think let's keep in mind that we're all saying the U.S. is not as important strategically. Who has the biggest military footprint in the region today? I mean, let's just be frank. And we for all the talk on China, and we talk about China being influential politically, economically, but who has the biggest footprint in the region? And that's not likely to diminish substantially anytime soon. And frankly, put aside commitment to allies, any kind of threat to allies that might come is likely to come from very clear sources. And the U.S. is not interested in the empowerment of those sources. In the case of the Gulf, Iran, regardless of what it might think of a particular regime in the Middle East, does not want to see Iran become a hegemon in the region. It's not in American interest, regardless of what how the U.S. might view the Middle East. So I'm not really sure that that's particularly consequential in terms of the issues. In terms of human rights, I think I agree with my colleagues that this is an important issue for most of the group around Biden. It is also to him, but especially important to a lot of the people that he's appointed. It's not a coincidence. It's in my polling within the U.S., what I have seen is that Democrats value issues, democracy, human rights. In fact, if you look at our own politics right now, and we're trying to figure out, how to rationally persuade people to do X, Y, Z, it's not almost a rational debate because it's an identity debate, a value debate. It's between a certain set, competition between very different values that Trump represented, and values that tend to be more, anchored in the Democratic Party, including human rights, international law, and democracy. And because we are intensely focused on that, because our own democracy was seen to have been threatened and continues to be threatened, because our own, human rights have been challenged, because we're in the middle of a racial divide, this did rise in the priorities. And don't kid yourself, in the priorities of the politics of America within the Democratic Party, in Congress, at the public level, among Democratic elites. How it'll play itself out, I don't know. But no Democrat can just avoid it, because the pressure is going to come and they're going to have to find a way to do it. Of course, as always, they will, balance their strategic interests, the politics, the diplomacy with this interest. But I do believe this issue is going to rise, not simply in contrast to Trump, who obviously didn't pay attention to it, but I think because it's built into our politics right now.
Thank you very much, Shibli. In fact, you have answered indirectly a question that was put by one of the participants, which was about the effects of the January 6th events on American foreign policy. And you have talked very well about the mood and the internal situation in the US and its consequences for foreign policy. Thank you very much to all. I think I cannot go on and on in concluding, but I'll just say that what I understood is that there is a general agreement, more or less, that the United States administration has more pressing issues before itself. It has more priorities internally than externally, and certainly the Middle East is not among even the top international priorities. However, the Middle East issues will press themselves, and the administration will not be able to ignore them. Unfortunately, it will not ignore them, but it will do that without much conviction, which means that the problems will linger on and on and on and on, with a possible exception, which is the Iran nuclear program. Probably this is where the priority in the Middle East of the US administration is. And in fact, as it was said, in order to keep the US from being entangled in the region, the Iran nuclear program is a priority because the US does not want to be drawn into the conflicts in the region. All events that are interesting leave many issues open for further discussion at later events. I guess that we'll organize more of these events because so many issues have been raised that have not been answered. Thank you very much, Shibli Tarhami. Thank you very much, President Richard Doney. Thank you very much, Alan Stoga, for being with us today. Of course, I will not thank the host, Nabil Fahmy. I will leave the final word for him. We will have taken 15 minutes more than those allotted to us. So you have 2 minutes, Nabil, to close this event.
No, I won't even take 2 minutes. Let me simply be straightforward and precise. I really want to thank my distinguished panelists participating today. As expected, they provided tremendous insight into what's happening. They were honest and straightforward in their responses. And let me also thank the audience that was quite significant in terms of its numbers and its the level of the audience. This is, for American University and for the School of Global Affairs, an important event because it allows us to bring in the rigor of academia to public issues and have a discussion that goes well beyond our multiple campuses now in Cairo into not only, frankly, the Egyptian environment, but given COVID and we're doing everything on Zoom, the region and internationally. So everybody's looking at America and America is looking around the world. Hopefully we'll find common ground and work together because that's ultimately the mutual interest to us also. Thank you all for being here and hope to see you again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye to the panelists and to the audience. Thank you very much to the audience for being with us until this hour. Bye-bye.